Welcome to The Thing About Salem, the podcast that offers bite-sized episodes about the Salem Witch Trials. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. Our ancestors experienced the Salem Witch Trials.
Today we're looking at the Devil's Library. We tend to think of the Salem Witch Trials as an isolated explosion, but the magistrates and ministers were actually following centuries of written precedent.
The idea of the demonic pact and the infamous Devil's Book didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was built through foundational theological texts, English witch hunting manuals, and local New England bestsellers. Let's open the books that built the Salem witch hunt.
To understand Salem, we first have to go back to 1486 and a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. Written primarily by Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, aka Instatorus, with Jakob Springer's name attached to lend it university credibility, it became one of the most infamous and widely read books during the witch trial period.
The Malleus, which came out of Europe, functioned as a complete manual for witch hunters. Crucially, it solidified the idea of a vast, secret, anti-Christian conspiracy where witches willingly entered into a formal, literal pact with the devil. It provided the theological bedrock for prosecuting witches across continents. In the Malleus, Kramer argues that it is a sinful act of apostasy to pay attention to magicians and astrologers because they make pacts with demons.
Fast forward to 1597, and we get another book massively influential on the New England Puritans, Daemonologie, is written by King James VI of Scotland, who later became King James I of England. He actually wrote the book to prove the existence of witches after he believed they summoned storms to drown his bride at sea.
Because of his authority, people believed it must be true. King James laid out sufficient proofs for witchcraft, focusing heavily on familiar spirits and demonic pacts. King James wrote that it was by pact alone that people were addicted to the devil's service. In the pact, the devil offers up some trifling goodies in exchange for the work of their bodies and souls, which are the only things the devil hunts for. This royal obsession with the devil's covenant trickled down directly to the Salem court's understanding of what it meant to sign the devil's book.
By the 1600s, English writers were producing their own guides. William Perkins wrote a Discourse of the Damned Art of Witchcraft in 1608, which described the diabolical compact in detail and established 7 grounds for determining suspicion of witchcraft. In this work, he writes that the diabolical pact can be either expressly made through words exchanged by the witch and the devil, or the pact can be secret, not spoken aloud, but inferred by the witch taking some action to call upon the devil. In making the pact, the witch gives the devil their signature or some of their blood.
Richard Bernard followed in 1627 with A Guide to Grand Jury Men. During the Salem crisis in 1692, when the governor asked the Boston ministers for advice, Cotton Mather specifically recommended that the Salem judges follow the strict guidelines set forth by Perkins and Bernard.
But the most lethal English influence came from Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general who ran an intense witch-hunting campaign in East Anglia in the 1640s. In his 1647 book, The Discovery of Witches, he detailed his methods, such as searching for the witch's teeth and keeping suspects awake for days, watching, to see if familiars appeared.
The idea of signing the devil's book became a central feature of confessions during his campaign. Hopkins' lethal crusade was actually fiercely mocked after the fact. The poet Samuel Butler satirized Hopkins in his famous 17th century poem, Hudibras.
In the poem, Butler mocks the tradition of witch-finding by portraying Hopkins as a hypocrite who secretly possessed the devil's book, was a witch himself, and was eventually hanged for it. It shows that the concept of the devil's book was well established in the cultural consciousness long before Salem. And now we'll learn about the satirical Matthew Hopkins from Hudibras. Has not this present parliament a ledger to the devil sent? fully empowered to treat about finding revolted witches out? And has not he within a year hanged threescore of them in one shire? Some only for not being drowned, and some for sitting above ground. Whole days and nights upon their breeches, and feeling pain, were hanged for witches. And some for putting knavish tricks upon green geese and turkey chicks, or pigs that suddenly deceased, of griefs unnatural as he guessed, who after proved himself a witch, and made a rod for his own breech.
So the European and English traditions set the stage, but what provided the immediate script for Salem? That brings us to Cotton Mather's 1689 book, Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcrafts and Possessions.
Just 3 years before Salem, Mather's book detailed the afflictions of the Goodwin children in Boston, who were allegedly bewitched by an Irish woman named Goody Glover. The Goodwin children suffered from bizarre fits, were struck deaf and dumb, and claimed to be tormented by invisible forces.
When the Salem afflictions began in 1692, the girls' symptoms were practically a mirror image of the Goodwin children. Reverend Samuel Parris was actually living in Boston in 1688 when the Goody Glover case occurred, so his household was intimately aware of this story.
Mather's book was essentially a masterclass in diabolical agency. It circulated through New England, giving families a template of what it looked like to be bewitched and what it meant to be attacked by the devil's agents. As Reverend John Hale later noted in his own writings, the sufferings in Salem were identical to the Goodwin case, just escalated.
From the Malleus Maleficarum to Memorable Providences, the Salem Witch Trials weren't a sudden, unexplainable madness. They were the tragic, logical conclusion of 200 years of printed theology and legal manuals.
The judges in Salem were just following the literal textbook definitions of how to hunt a witch, look for the devil's mark, and demand confessions about the devil's book.
By the time the Salem Witch Trials began in 1692, the image of a literal book carried spectrally from house to house and pressed into unwilling hands was as familiar to Salem's ministers and magistrates as any passage of Scripture. When the first formal accusations were filed, it did not take long for that book to appear.
On February 27, 1692, days before the first charges were even filed, Ann Putnam Jr. claimed that she was haunted by the suspected specter of Sarah Good, who grievously tortured and vehemently attempted to get her to sign the devil's book. This stands as the first accusation of signing the devil's book in the Salem crisis.
Curiously, the physical description of the infamous book was highly inconsistent throughout the trials, constantly changing in color, shape, size, and material, depending on who was testifying.
Meanwhile, that same day, servant Elizabeth Hubbard named both Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne as her tormentors, alleging that Osborne's specter afflicted her and that Good's specter similarly urged her to write in the book.
Then, on March 2nd, during her examination, Tituba confessed to making her mark in the devil's book with blood. She said the book was already signed by 9 witches.
2 of the others were unidentified women that she had already identified as being part of the devil's company but didn't note their names. And Tituba was not able to read the names in the book, but the devil did tell her that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had signed.
That left 7 unidentified witches roaming Massachusetts, some in Salem and others in Boston.
On March 14, 1692, Abigail Williams claimed she was tempted to put her hand to the devil's book and even saw Martha Corey at the devil's sacrament. Mercy Lewis said she was urged vehemently to write in the book.
This is crucial because it frames Martha Corey not just as a lone actor, but as part of a larger, organized, diabolical conspiracy, which was the ultimate fear of the Salem magistrates.
And that's part of the fear they had around the devil's book. With all these names in there, that means there's all these witches around. And now we'd like to read to you more from the Malleus Maleficarum on the demonic pact.
As for sorceresses, however much they may retain the faith in their heart while renouncing it by their mouth, they are nonetheless judged apostates on the ground that they have made a treaty with death and an agreement with hell.
Hence, in speaking of the similar acts of magicians and of those who in any way seek assistance from demons, St. Thomas says, there is apostasy from the faith in all of them because of an agreement entered into with a demon, either by word only, if an invocation is involved, or by some deed, even if sacrifices do not play a role. For a man cannot serve two masters.
To the same effect, the Malleus says, Albert gives the following response. In such people, there is always apostasy of word or work. If invocations are made, then an open pact is entered into with demons, and in that case, there is clear apostasy by words. If, on the other hand, it is done merely through a simple work, then it is apostasy by work. Since there is always an insult to the faith in the case of all such people, and that they expect from the demon what they should expect from God, it is always judged to be apostasy.
See how clearly they describe the two kinds of apostasy? They suggest a third kind, apostasy by heart. But even in the absence of this, sorceresses are judged to be apostates by words and by works. Therefore, they ought to be subject to the penalties for both heretics and apostates.
There is also in them a third kind of heinous crime that surpasses all other heresies. If, according to Augustine, every way of life of the faithless is sin, everything that does not derive from the faith is sin. Romans 14:23. What must one judge about their entire way of life, that is, about all the other works of sorceresses that are not, however, performed to please the demons, like fasting, going frequently to church, taking communion, and so on?
In all of these acts, they commit a mortal sin, which is explained as follows. The taint caused by this sin is so great that although it does not altogether cut out the possibility of redemption, since sin does not ruin all the good in nature and the natural light remains in them nonetheless, unless they are absolved by God, the homage they have rendered means that all their works, even those belonging to the category of good ones, belong instead to that of bad ones, something that is not seen in the case of other faithless people. Thomas says that while the works of the faithless that belong to the category of good works, like fast, the giving of alms, and the like, do not bring them merit because of their lack of faith, which is the most severe of sins. Nonetheless, because sin does not ruin the entire good of nature and the natural light remains within them, not every act of theirs is a mortal sin. Instead, in their case, every act is a mortal sin if it derives from lack of faith or pertains to it, even if the act belongs to the category of good ones. This is how to understand the passage of Augustine, every way of life of the faithless is sin.
Today, we want your signature on the petition for the 5 women who were hanged in Boston and have never had their names cleared. Please sign that petition at change.org/witch trials.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Thing About Salem.